This episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Jomo Ibarra. Jomo Ibarra grew up in Gonzales, Monterey, California. He came from a hard-working, modest family where his mother and father both did their best to provide for their blended family. All told, there were 5 brothers and 4 sisters. Jomo's mom was the type of traditional Mexican-American mother that spoke more Spanish than English and always did her best to keep her kids on the right path. She was a strong-willed, strict kind of mother who knew she would have to fight tooth and nail to keep all her kids out of trouble. Monterey County has always been a county strife with gangs, criminal activity, and all the other inequities that come from living in an impoverished, socially deprived community. She did her best to keep all the kids in school, but as the years went by and things got harder, they would each find their own path in life and gravitate in different directions. Despite the efforts of coming from a good family with strong family values and traditional ways, Jomo started getting involved in street gangs when he was around 12 years old. From the onset, since he was a youngster, he was fascinated by gangs and how they functioned. He wasn't your average gangbanger who just got involved because he was seeking family or because he was trying to fill some type of void that was missing in his young life. He was the type of young gang member that really took an interest in the dynamics of gangs and what they really represented. As he got older, he slipped deeper and deeper into that abyss. He sought knowledge from a lot of the older gang members and was always asking questions, trying to betterly educate himself. Most young gang members aren't motivated or galvanized the way Jomo was. Originally from Gonzales, he ended up getting involved with a gang called NSG, Northside Gonzales. A lot of people don't know this, but one of the incidents that Jomo was known for took place at Fairview Middle School in Gonzales when he was in 8th grade. One day when Jomo was in class, he was wearing a red baseball cap that he usually always wore. But on this particular day, the school's principal, Mr. Santana, was making his customary rounds, walking from class to class. When he got to the classroom where Jomo was at, he took notice of the red baseball cap Jomo was wearing. Mr. Santana immediately demanded that Jomo take off his hat, as it was against school policy and he wasn't supposed to be wearing a hat in class. Mr. Santana was one of them hardline kind of principals who was strict and who didn't tolerate any breaking of the rules. Jomo wasn't an exception either. In all fairness to Jomo, Mr. Santana could have pulled him out in the hallway to talk to him or could have got at him alone. Because yelling at Jomo in front of the whole class and putting him on the spot like that made him feel belittled, and it just made him feel like he was being openly fronted off. This caused Jomo to refuse. He looked at Mr. Santana and basically told him he wasn't going to comply with his rules or his authority. Mr. Santana obviously now felt like his authority was being undermined and that he was openly being challenged, because without saying another word, he walked over to Jomo's desk and just took his hat off his head. What happened next would make Jomo popular amongst his peers and his fellow classmates, because he was remembered for this for years. Jomo jumped up and knocked Mr. Santana out. He didn't just hit him with the haymaker. He knocked him smooth off his suspensions to the point that Mr. Santana hit the deck and did one of them stiff arm routines. The boy was out. This was the beginning of his reputation. Those that went to school with him never forgot about this. Homeboys that would run into Jomo years later, when they were older, would always reminisce about this and would laugh about it. This was also the first time Jomo got into trouble as an adolescent and ultimately sparked his long-running criminal career. In 1994, his mother and father split up. They had tried desperately to make their relationship work, especially for the sake of keeping the family together. But aside from some of their personal indifferences, some of the financial and economic strains just was too much for them to bear, and ultimately they split up. After their separation, Jomo's mother moved him and his family to Salinas. This only resulted in Jomo and his brothers to slip deeper and deeper into gangs and other trouble that they'd find out there in the streets of Salinas. This is also when Jomo started getting into trouble as an adolescent. Speaking of trouble, when Jomo started running around with NSG, he had a close friend named Jeffrey Carrasco. At one time, they used to hang around with each other and were real close. Carrasco used to come by the house. They used to break bread together, and Carrasco was almost like family to Jomo. Later on, an incident that involved one of Hector Copas Gallegos' nephews would actually seal that bond and create a lot of fallout. Copas became a highly influential figure in Salinas after he went to prison and was recruited into the NF. But he also had a huge family in Salinas that also commanded a lot of influence themselves. Being one of the biggest families out there, they eventually made a name for themselves. And when people referred to them, they were simply called the Gallegos. Jomo never had an issue with Copas or his family, but his friend Carrasco apparently got into an issue with some of Copas' nephews. It stemmed from money that was owed, and from there it just went all bad. Jomo wasn't involved, he just ended up getting pulled into it. One day when Jomo was driving, he spotted his friend Jeffrey Carrasco getting beat up and seeing one of the Gallegos trying to stuff him in the trunk of a car. Later on, Carrasco told Jomo that the Gallegos that was trying to stuff him into the trunk told him that he was going to drive him out to one of the salad fields and that he was going to kill him. Jomo just happened to be driving by when he seen this happening. So he flips a bitch, pulls up, grabs a baseball bat that he had in the back seat, and tried to stop this guy from kidnapping his boy. Things ended up escalating to the point where Jomo pulls out the baseball bat and tells the Gallegos to let Carrasco go. When he refused and tried closing the trunk, Jomo cracks this guy in the back of the head with the bat. Needless to say, this helped his boy get out of the jam he was in, but the Gallegos he busted in the head became a handicap behind that incident. He ended up with a permanent brain injury to the point of him being almost retarded. I'm not sure how he got caught up for this, but I do know that this was one of the reasons why he was sent to CYA, and it became a big issue for the Gallegos family. All these different things that Jomo was getting himself involved in only resulted in him getting deeper and deeper into the streets. And Salinas offered the perfect sanctum to help lead him down that dreaded path. Jomo and one of his brothers named Angel seemed to be the two who were the most entrenched in gangs, and they had a huge level of influence over the others. All of Jomo's brothers became influenced by him and how he was becoming more and more involved with gangs, but Angel seemed to be the one who began to glorify it the most. He emphatically tried his hardest to follow in his brother's footsteps, and it was obvious that he was trying to emulate Jomo. He embraced this by teaching him and indoctrinating him about all the things he had learned himself with respects to gangbanging and being a member of NSG. Later, he would regret this, but Angel became his number one protege. Even though Angel was older, he still became his protege. The one defining difference that set them apart is drugs. Angel got heavily addicted to drugs and sunk deeper and deeper into his addiction. He became an influential little homie out there in his own right and started several gangs out there. Supposedly, these gangs are still in existence to this day. One of them is NSS, Northside Santa. From what I've heard, Charlie Brown made a big impact on Santa Cruz and became well known out there. As Jomo started to run the streets and hang out with NSG, he got real close with another NSG member by the name of Robert Racho. Together they started getting into trouble, robbing people, beating people up, and doing the typical shit that young gang members get involved in. On Christmas Eve of 1994, when he was 19, Jomo and Robert Racho got into a shootout at the Cordera camp with a dude named Joaquin Perez. This was somebody Jomo was well aware of, as he had been part of that ongoing conflict that involved the Gallegos that Jomo had hit in the head with a baseball bat. The area where this kicked off at is like a small isolated labor camp where a lot of paisas and field workers congregate. At any given time during the day, you can drive by and see those white field buses parked there and dozens of paisas eating lunch and just out there lounging. But this individual, Joaquin Perez, was tied in with the Gallegos, one of Copas' nephews. So when they seen him, it was on sight. This all stemmed from the incident when Jomo hit one of the Gallegos in the head and rendered him a handicap. Ever since that incident occurred, it's always had been on sight with any of the Gallegos whenever they crossed paths. Jomo jumped out, drew his weapon, and began firing. Like I said, that area was a spot where a lot of paisas and field workers congregated throughout the day. So this is the only reason why that shootout turned out to be such a big deal out there. People literally started running and ducking everywhere. This was out of fear of not getting hit or catching a stray bullet. Joaquin Perez, on the other hand, just so happened to be packing himself. He jumped out and started returning fire. The whole incident happened in less than 2 minutes, but when the shooting stopped, Joaquin Perez was laying in a pool of his own blood. He was struck in the neck, and this would ultimately result in him being a quadriplegic for the rest of his life. This would also result in both Jomo and Robert Racho getting convicted and sentenced to 3 years in state prison. Several civilian witnesses who were there at the shooting ended up testifying at the preliminary hearing. So in the end, knowing that convictions at trial were imminent, they both entered into no contest pleas. There was no end to how far he would go insofar as bringing them around and having him at home at his mom's house. This is something that Jomo and his brothers didn't agree with, but Angel was older and he didn't care. He continued to do things the way he seen fit. Because he started selling drugs to make money and to support his addiction, the crowds he started associating with were basically anybody and everybody. One of the things that Angel used to do that Jomo hated is that he'd have their mom there cooking and cleaning up after everyone while they'd be there at the house, cutting, weighing, and smoking dope. There would be beer cans, pipes, and other drug paraphernalia strewn all over the house while his mom was made to clean up after them. In her eyes, there was no wrong that Angel could do, and she never said nothing about it. She just kind of tolerated it. Meanwhile, Jomo's other 3 brothers began following down that same path as well. Like so many other young gang members who get involved in that kind of toilsome lifestyle, they all started getting into trouble. As time went on and Jomo's brothers and sisters got older, the family experienced several tragedies. The first one happened in 1988 when Ray was shot and killed in San Jose. Ironically, it didn't have nothing to do with gangbanging. It stemmed from a domestic violence dispute that he just happened to get caught up in. Apparently some white dude shot and killed Ray because he was at the wrong place at the right time. The dude had just beat the shit out of his old lady earlier in the day and ended up getting arrested for a DV. After getting released from jail, the dude came back with a shotgun, obviously intent on finishing the job, when he ran into Ray, who was standing outside next to some double doors. This dude just walked up and shot him. He didn't even say a word to him. He just smoked him. Maybe he thought he had something to do with his old lady, or maybe he thought he was somehow involved. But whatever the case was, he just shot him with the shotgun, and then he located his old lady and killed her as well. In 1989, less than a year after Ray was killed, and while the family was still in the grieving process, one of Jomo's younger sisters committed suicide by driving her car off a bridge at Rio Vista. This incident affected Jomo's mother especially hard, as this was one of her youngest daughters and she was extremely close to her. It's hard for any parent having to go through the process of burying their children, because it's just not supposed to be that way. Your kids are supposed to bury you after you've seen them live out a long, prosperous life. But more often than not, this is what happens to a lot of families that come from these types of backgrounds. But there was still more to come. On November 2nd, 1992, Jomo's protege, Angel, got into a verbal disagreement with what was supposed to be one of his closest friends, Jesse Lozoya. This incident took place in front of an apartment complex on Sunrise Street in Salinas. Coincidentally, this happened right down the street from where I was living when I was out there in Salinas. The disagreement was over money and how much was being collected on behalf of the NF in Chinatown. Apparently, Jesse and Angel were out there taxing people and collecting money on behalf of the regiment. In the course of them collecting these funds, for whatever reason, Jesse accused Angel of bilking money and keeping large amounts for himself. As a result, Jesse reported this. A green light was issued and Angel was stabbed. He died about an hour later as one of the stab wounds punctured his heart. The cold part about it is that Jesse was waiting outside his son's school, waiting to pick up his son when it happened. That's where the argument started, in front of his son's school. Knowing that his son would be coming out any minute, Jesse still stabbed Angel and then jumped in the car and split. So his son ended up coming out a few minutes later and was exposed to what had happened to Angel. His little boy didn't know what was going on, but Angel was a family friend, someone who had been over to his house quite a bit, and seeing him laying there bleeding out obviously had to have had a traumatizing effect on him. There's no question as to how difficult this must have been for Jomo's mother, having already lost 2 sons and a daughter, but bad fate still wasn't done with him yet. December 21st, 1997 brought the next tragedy. Charlie Brown, one of Jomo's last remaining 2 brothers, was shot and killed by an MS-13 shot caller in Santa Cruz. The MS-13 member, who went by the name Chex, knew who Charlie Brown was, and when he spotted him, he opened fire and killed him in broad daylight. Charlie Brown at one point moved out to Santa Cruz, and while he was out there, he made a name for himself and was well known on the streets. He supposedly started 2 Norteño street gangs out there that are still in existence today, one being NSS, Northside Santa. Just as he was known and recognized out there on the streets by the Norteños, the opposition made it their business to find out who he was as well, and for that reason alone, it ended up making him a huge target. Santa Cruz has always been known as a Sureño stronghold, so none of this comes as a real surprise. When Chex killed Charlie Brown, a whole week hadn't even passed before the homeboys assembled a squad, and a quick retaliation was exacted. Put a squad together, went to this guy Chex's house, and then they killed him and everybody in the house, his whole family. Retribution came swiftly and immediate. Supposedly, they even took some hand grenades there and threw them through this guy's windows, but apparently the grenades ended up being duds. Probably because they had been sitting in somebody's man cave for decades. As far as I know, nobody that was involved in the killing of Chex and his family were never identified or arrested. This concluded another diabolical chapter in the gang wars in Santa Cruz, but for Jomo's mother, her grieving was once again about to begin. After the deaths of his brothers and his sister, Jomo continued to elevate his gang career. In his mind, this was the only refuge that hadn't failed him, and besides that, he felt an obligation to the game after losing so many brothers. They had to count for something, some unknown purpose. After Jomo went to the joint for the shootout he got into, he ended up getting recruited into the NR and started getting indoctrinated by some of the hermanos and the C's that he was around in there. At that time, San Quentin was still the reception center, so from Quentin, they shipped him off to Susanville. Not long after he hit Susie's house, Jomo got caught up in a melee with the Southsiders and picked up an indie tournament shoe. He stayed there in Adseg at Susanville for a few months, and then he ended up getting shipped off to Pelican Bay. Surprisingly, his mentor and the NF member that took an interest in him and his indoctrination was none other than Rudy Dancing Bear Miramontes from San Jose. It's unbelievable, but it is what it is. Dancing Bear DB was with Jomo and C facility, as that just so happened to be the pod that Jomo landed in. While they were together, DB also began schooling him on the street activities and everything he needed to know with regard to street functions. In 1995, when Jomo ended up paroling, he got out and plugged in with Cesar Lobo Ramirez, who at that time was the acting RC for Salinas. The position was actually being shuffled back and forth between Lobo and Rico Smiley Garcia, depending on who was out. But when Jomo stepped out, Smiley was doing a short parole violation, so Lobo was the RC. Like the rest of us that paroled out there to Salinas, Jomo was appointed a legendary parole officer by the name of Bordoff. Most of the homeboys from Salinas that paroled with gang stipulations or gang conditions were assigned to Bordoff's caseload. This dude was notorious for staying on top of homeboys out there, and he did his homework. When I was paroled to Salinas, this guy rolled me and didn't give me a chance to do shit. Eventually, I ended up getting assigned to Tim Work, who was Bordoff's protege. So I don't know who was worse, Bordoff or Tim Work. But after Tim Work became my parole officer, I was only out there for about a month before he violated me for just being in the same car with Mateo's sister, Sophie Rocha. I got a flat year, and she wasn't even a documented gang member. She was just a family member of Mateo's, but they still gave me 12 months flat for it anyway. So when Jomo paroled, he plugged in the regiment, and this is when he started running around out there in Salinas with Lobo, Chente, Spukio, shout out to Spukio, and some of the others who were functioning out there. In fact, Jomo and one of his other brothers, Jamo, were also real close to Spukio, someone who a lot of you have heard about before, and used to run around with him when they lived in an apartment complex off of North Main in Alvin. So here's some exclusive information about what led to Jomo cooperating and why his loyalty to the NF changed. I know everyone claims that they have exclusive content that's groundbreaking and that's never before been heard, but this really is information that's never been documented anywhere before. One night, Lobo called Jomo and told him that he needed him to go with him somewhere and that he'd be by to pick him up. At the time, Jomo was asleep. He was knocked out and was in recovery mode after a night of drinking and partying the night before. He told Lobo that he was still sleeping and to hit him up later. But Lobo insisted that he get up and get ready. This was uncharacteristic. They had a set routine that they normally went by. So later on, Jomo would even say himself that it just seemed a little uncharacteristic for Lobo to keep insisting the way he did that night. Eventually, Jomo gets up and Lobo comes by with Chente and swoops him up. When Lobo gets there, he tells Jomo to drive, and then he slips into the back seat and has Chente riding shotgun. It was typical. Lobo liked to feel like he was being chauffeured around, so it wasn't nothing that Jomo had any reason to be concerned about. So at one point, they're driving by North Main in an area where Roy's Burger used to be, and Lobo pulls over at a 7-Eleven and says he's going to use the payphone. It didn't occur to Jomo at the time. I guess he really didn't trip off it. But Lobo had a cell phone, so it really didn't make any sense for him to have a need to use a payphone. I don't know. Maybe he didn't raise any red flags because I guess it's really not that uncommon for someone who's involved in criminal activity to use a payphone or another phone that's not theirs to place a call from either. It would make sense later, but at the time, it didn't raise any red flags. At any rate, when Lobo jumped out to use the phone, Jomo and Chente take notice of a newer model white Cadillac with tinted windows that pulls into the 7-Eleven parking lot real slow and then pulls around to the opposite side of the building. As they're still looking in that direction, suspicious because of the way the Cadillac drove by, a guy wearing a Cowboys jersey and a Cowboys beanie runs up and says, "Sureño puto," and unloads a whole clip on them. Jomo got hit several times. I believe it was a total of 6 altogether. I know he took one in the stomach and in the arm, but the bullet he took in the arm went through his bicep, traveled through his elbow, and then hit Chente in the side of the head. Chente is lucky it didn't kill him, but it tore a chunk out of his head. A lot of people don't know this, but Chente has a big metal plate on the left side of his head, and this is why. If you look at his picture, you can see it. So when this dude finished emptying his clip, Jomo jumped out and wrestled the gun out of his hands. He actually took the gun away from this cat, but the clip was empty, so the gun was worthless. He actually would have been better off just letting the dude take off with the gun though, because it ended up getting him a year parole violation. The cops, paramedics, and the fire department end up getting there within minutes, and once they figured out everything that had happened, later on they gave Jomo a year for taking the gun and having it in his possession. They didn't catch him with the gun right there on the scene, otherwise they probably would have stuck him with the new case. The way they found out that he took the gun is because they looked in the surveillance tapes and seen what happened. After Jomo and Chente get shot, they take them to the hospital and they both end up staying there for about 2 weeks. Both had serious injuries. After they make their recoveries and they get released from the hospital, it was about 2 weeks later that parole reviews the surveillance tapes and decides to violate Jomo for taking the gun. The picture to the right shows Jomo wearing a cast about 5 days after getting released from the hospital. Soon after that, he was given a parole violation. But it soon became obvious that parole was up to something. Jomo knew something was up, but at the time it still wasn't clear yet. Because they did something with him that I've only seen them do one other time before. Instead of going to San Quentin or Santa Rita from the county jail, they arranged a special transport van to have Jomo taken straight to Pelican Bay from Monterey County Jail. I've only seen them do that one other time before with another NF member. Keep in mind, Jomo had just finished getting shot 6 times. He was still healing up when he got shipped back to Pelican Bay. So he was still coming down from the mental and physical strains it put him through. For those of you who've been shot, I'm sure you can relate to how difficult it can sometimes be to recover from something like that. I've been through it, so I know. Aside from healing from your physical injuries and how it might have damaged your body, you also have to deal with how it affects you mentally. Depending on how you got shot, it can be a tough process. So here's where it gets interesting, and here's what a lot of people don't know about. People assume that Jomo just got tired, that he just got weak, and got to a point in his career where he just didn't want to function anymore. Even that book, Blood in the Fields, didn't document this, because this was something she probably didn't even know. And this book was written by a news columnist, Julia Reynolds, a Harvard graduate who spent months outsourcing and researching the NF and Salinas and the whole regiment in particular. Her book stated that Jomo just wanted out, that he was tired, and that he just started cooperating on a whim. That's not true. This is what really happened. While Jomo was still doing his violation in Pelican Bay, 2 FBI agents, Manny Alvarez and Roland Martinez, drove up there to pay him a visit. Their whole purpose was to flip him, and that's exactly what they did. When they pulled him out, they told him that the shooting that he was involved in was all set up and that it was coordinated by Lobo. This is a game that law enforcement typically plays. They play a cat and mouse game by trying to convince you that you're in bad standings, that you're about to be hit, that your name's on a BNL, a bad news list, etc., etc. I'm sure that Jomo knew this, and I'm sure that he would have normally just brushed this off. But when he started thinking about it, all the light bulbs started going off. One by one, they started lighting up, and then it all made sense. From Lobo's uncharacteristic phone call where he insisted for him to get out of bed and go with him that night, from Lobo using a payphone instead of his cell phone, and then the way this guy just pulled up and started shooting at them without really seeing who they were. It was a setup. On top of all that, it happened right after Lobo got out of the car. The thing that bothered Jomo about it, that he was trying to make sense of, is why would he chance setting something up like that while Chente was still in the car? Apparently, he either had mad trust in this guy's shooting ability, or he was trying to have him whacked too. Kind of reminds me of how people were trying to accuse Suge Knight of arranging Tupac's murder. Suge Knight would have had to have had some serious trust in the shooter's ability to shoot straight to be in the car while that happened. At any rate, this is when Jomo decided to turn. He felt betrayed, and this is when he told these guys that he was willing to work with them. So when Jomo paroled from Pelican Bay, he was already working with the feds, and they already had him in pocket. It didn't happen after he got out. From this point on, a lot of the story about how he cooperated and the damage that he did is already out there. So I'm not going to get into all that. Everyone knows what happened from there. Jomo started cooperating. Every time Lobo and Rico had a regimental meeting, or whenever they got together to discuss business, he was wired up and recorded everything. The one thing that was a little different about Jomo cooperating is that he didn't have a case. He wasn't looking at 100 years or nothing like that. For him, he just felt betrayed and couldn't get past the fact that Lobo set him up like that. And once he was done doing everything that they wanted him to do, he just wanted them to guarantee that they would provide federal assistance for himself and his family. That was the deal he made with Roland Martinez and Manny Ramirez. After going to several meetings with Lobo, Chente, Rico, and the rest of the regiment, his cooperation and the way they chose to use him and the information he was able to gather drew a lot of criticism. As was the case with Lizard and how it was discovered how he was double dealing, the defense attorneys that represented a lot of the defendants that his information was used against accused the feds again of having blood on their hands. During some of the recorded regimental meetings that Jomo recorded and attended, Rico and Lobo actually spoke about killing Copas and Shorty. This was well before Spookiel, Fish, Hermit, Chachi, or anyone else got picked up for allegedly committing any murders. The feds countered back by saying that they were on top of all these guys and that they had crews of BCU officers keeping surveillance on the potential targets. They also made reference to the fact that Jomo was wired up and that he was actually part of the squad that was tasked with killing Copas, Shorty, and some of the other targets that they had in their crosshairs. In fact, Jomo was riding in the car recording when they turned down Palmera Avenue in Salinas to kill Copas. They had two-way radios that they were using to communicate with, and the radios actually made it easier for Roland Martinez and Manny Alvarez to hear their conversations clearly. They were listening when Rico spotted the BCUs parked out in front of Copas' house, and the plot was aborted. In the end, after Jomo did everything that the FBI wanted him to do, and after he basically helped take down the whole Salinas regiment, he was poised to testify against all the defendants in the case. The day prior, that Roland Martinez and Manny Alvarez were scheduled to announce that Jomo Yabarra was a federal informant and that he was their star witness, they still had one other order of business to take care of first. It was part of fulfilling their end of their agreement and keeping their end of the promise that they made to Jomo. Without any reasonable or practical warning, they went by Jomo's mom's house and told his mom and his brother to grab what they could carry, that they were being whisked off to the Federal Witness Protection Program and that their lives would be recreated somewhere else. Of course, this was stunning news. That all of a sudden, law enforcement just comes to your house one day and tells you to leave all your belongings behind, to only grab what you could carry, and that life, as you know it, would no longer exist. This is a tough undertaking, one that often ends up creating deep resentment between family members like this. I mean, think about it. Because of personal choices you chose to make in your life, dumb choices, choices that have no real meaning or purpose to them, it now affects your family, the closest family to you, your immediate family. Their lives get uprooted. They have to leave everything behind and endure these drastic changes, all because you decided to be a gang member, because you chose to be a part of a criminal organization that hasn't done nothing but victimize people. And now, in the end, your own family has become victims too. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. I'm still working on the Q&A, which will come out in the next day or two. So if you still have questions, you still have time to get them in. This is going to be a running Q&A though. Since there's been so many questions, I'm just going to keep it going and separate it into 2 or 3 parts. With that said, we'll be running a live tonight and we'll update you guys on a few other things that we have going on. Like always, we appreciate you all of you who have continued to support us and who have kept us motivated to keep doing what we do.